Hello and welcome to KnowledgeNap. Find a comfortable place to rest. Allow yourself to settle in. Let your body grow heavy, supported by the surface beneath you. Take a slow, deep breath, and as you exhale, feel the tension of the day begin to melt away. There is nothing you need to do, and nowhere you need to be. Your only task is to listen and to drift. Tonight we are going on a journey to a place at the very edge of the map, a place of cold sea, high stone, and an unending wind. We are traveling north, far north, to the wild and remote coast of Scotland. Here the land itself feels ancient, a place of dark, peaty moors and rolling mists. This is the edge of the Outer Hebrides, a long, rugged chain of islands. They stand like a final wall, a last defense against the full and raw power of the North Atlantic Ocean. Picture this ocean. It is not the warm, turquoise water of a gentle coast. This is an ocean of immense cold and restless power. Its color is a deep, shifting iron gray, and in the low winter light, it often looks almost black. It is never truly calm. Even on its quietest days, a heavy, ancient swell rolls in from the deep, a memory of storms 1,000 miles away. This ocean has a voice. It is not a gentle lapping, but a constant, low roar, the sound of water that has traveled the width of the world to meet this final barrier of rock. Out in this water, far from the already remote main islands, there lies a tiny, lonely cluster of rocks. They are 17 miles west of the nearest inhabited land. They are called the Flannan Isles. For centuries, sailors knew them by a more ominous name, the Seven Hunters. These are not islands in the way you might imagine a welcoming shore. They are jagged fangs of black stone, rising sheer from the churning, white-tipped sea. There are no trees here. The wind is too constant, too violent. It would tear any sapling from the shallow, rocky soil. There is only a tough, matted grass bent flat by the gales, and in the crevices, small patches of sea thrift, a small pink flower that trembles in the constant, salt-laced air. The islands are a kingdom of birds, gulls and gannets and fulmars. Their cries are the only real voice of the place, a wild, sharp, and lonely sound that weaves itself into the endless sound of the wind. For centuries, these islands were only a danger, a place of myth and fear. Even the shepherds from the main islands who would sometimes risk the journey to graze their sheep on the tough grass would not stay the night. They believed the island was not empty. They believed it was a sacred or perhaps haunted place, a place that did not welcome men after the sun had set. At night, Eilean Mòr, the largest of these rocks, was just a black spot in the ocean, a lightless, treacherous graveyard for any ship caught in a storm. But in the year 1899, the world had changed. This was an age of industry, of steam, and of great engineering. It was an age of conquering the wild and dangerous places. And so men came to Eilean Mòr, the Big Isle. And on its highest point, they built a masterpiece, a lighthouse. It was a staggering feat of construction. They blasted a landing stage from the solid rock at the base of the cliff. They painstakingly cut a steep, winding staircase into the sheer, black rock face. They built a small, crude railway to haul supplies 150 feet up to the summit. And there, on the island's highest point, they raised a tower. It stood 75 feet tall, a cylinder of brilliant whitewashed stone. It was solid, proud, and anchored to the very rock of the island. It was a monument to safety, a promise of vigilance. It was designed to withstand 100-foot wave, to stand immovable against winds of over 100 miles per hour. It was a human candle lit in the vast, wild dark. Inside its glass lantern room, at the very top, was a marvel of the age, a giant, hyper-radiant Fresnel lens. It was a beautiful, intricate sculpture of crystal prisms standing taller than a man. Its purpose was to take the simple, steady flame of a paraffin lamp and to focus it, to click it, into a beam of light so powerful it could be seen for over 20 miles. It had a character, a rhythm, 2 white flashes every 30 seconds, a steady, reliable mechanical heartbeat in the darkness, telling every ship, "I am here, I am watching, stay away from the rocks." To keep this vital light burning, 3 men lived in the tower. They were the keepers of the light. Their life was one of profound, almost monastic isolation, and it was governed by a strict, unwavering routine. The lighthouse was their entire world, a small, self-contained circle of stone and glass and metal, suspended between the wild sea and the empty sky. Their days were governed by the clock and their duties recorded in the official logbook. They worked in rotating shifts, ensuring that one man was always on watch, no matter what. The light was their sacred duty. Their work was constant. They tended to the giant clockwork mechanism that slowly turned the massive lens. This mechanism was driven by heavy weights which had to be wound by hand every few hours. They polished the brass fittings until they shone like gold. They trimmed the wicks of the powerful lamp. Most importantly, they polished every single prism of the great lens. A single fingerprint, a speck of dust, or the soot from the lamp could dim the life-saving beam. In their off hours, they lived in the dwelling built into the base of the tower. They cooked their meals in the small kitchen, the sound of the wind a constant companion, pressing against the thick stone walls. They read, they mended their clothes, they wrote letters to a world that felt 1,000 miles away. They were a tiny, isolated family, held together by their shared duty and by the shared, immense solitude of their post. They were the silent keepers, and in December of 1900, just 1 year after the light was first lit, they and their light vanished from the world. Our story of the vanishing begins not with the men, but with the light itself, or rather, with its absence. It begins on the cold, clear night of December 15th, 1900. The steamship Arctur was on its regular passage from Philadelphia, making its way through the dark, treacherous waters toward the port of Leith in Scotland. The captain was on the bridge. He knew these waters well. He was expecting, and depending on, the new, powerful beam of the Flannan light to give him his bearing, to confirm his position. He scanned the dark horizon to the spot where the light should be, and he saw nothing, just a patch of impenetrable blackness where a bright, 2-flash warning should have been. The lighthouse was out. This simple, chilling fact was almost unthinkable. A lighthouse of this importance, manned by 3 experienced keepers, does not just go out. Its failure suggests a catastrophe. The keepers are bound by a duty that is absolute, a duty to keep the light burning above all else. The captain of the Arctur was deeply unsettled. He checked his charts. He checked his position. He scanned the horizon again, searching for the familiar double flash. There was only darkness. When his ship finally and safely reached port, he immediately sent a telegraph to the Northern Lighthouse Board. The message was simple and urgent. Flannan Isles light is unlit. This news was received at first with disbelief, and then with immediate rising alarm. A relief vessel was needed, and quickly. But the sea, as if sensing the urgency, began to move. A massive storm, a truly terrible storm even for the notoriously violent North Atlantic, blew in from the west. It descended upon the Hebrides with a primal fury. It trapped all ships in their harbors. For days, the ocean was a screaming chaos of wind and rain and churning mountainous waves. The wind howled through the coastal towns, driving sea spray far inland like sharp, stinging needles. No ship could leave the harbor. To even attempt the 17-mile crossing to Eilean Mòr would be suicide. The official relief vessel, the lighthouse tender named the Hesperus, was forced to wait, docked in the relative safety of Briascleet harbor. Its captain, Jim Harvey, waited, and the relief keeper, Joseph Mòr, waited with him. Mòr was the man who was scheduled to travel to the lighthouse. He was meant to relieve one of the keepers, to swap places with him and begin his own long, isolated shift on the rock. He knew the men who were out there. He knew James Ducat, the principal keeper, a seasoned and steady veteran. He knew Thomas Marshall, the second assistant, and he knew Donald MacArthur, the occasional keeper, a burly, tough islander known as a brawler, a man who knew the sea and feared nothing. As the storm raged day after day, the anxiety on the Hesperus grew heavy and thick. December 20th. December 21st, Christmas Eve. Christmas Day passed, with the storm still howling, and still the light on Eilean Mòr was dark. The dread on the ship was palpable. What could have happened that 3 capable men could not light a lamp? Finally, on the cold grey morning of Boxing Day, December 26th, the storm broke. The wind eased its scream to a low, mournful moan. The sea, while still dangerous, swollen and heavy, was at last passable. At dawn, the Hesperus fired its boilers. Its smokestack billowed black smoke into the grey sky. It steamed out of the harbor into the cold, troubled ocean, to find out what had happened to the silent keepers. Joseph Mòr stood on the deck of the Hesperus, wrapped in his heavy wool and oilskins. The crossing was rough. The ship rose high on the backs of the huge green-grey swells, and then fell sickeningly into the troughs between them. For hours, Mòr stared at the empty western horizon, waiting for the first glimpse of the island. Finally it appeared. First, it was just a dark smudge, then a solid dark shape, and then the distinct, clear white line of the lighthouse tower. As they drew closer, he and all the men on the deck stared at the island. They were searching with desperate eyes for any sign of life. The lighthouse stood stark and perfect against the bruised sky. But there was no plume of smoke from the dwelling's chimney to show that a fire was lit. There was no flag flying on the mast, the customary signal that all was well. And on the concrete landing stage, far below the tower, there were no familiar figures in their blue serge uniforms, waiting to catch the mooring ropes. The island was utterly silent. Captain Harvey brought the ship as close as he dared. The waves were still crashing violently against the base of the cliffs, sending huge plumes of white spray into the air. He ordered the ship's whistle to be blown. A long, powerful, mournful blast. The sound hit the cliffs and echoed back, a hollow sound. The only answer was a vast white cloud of gulls, screaming as they were startled from their perches on the tower. They wheeled and cried in a frantic, swirling cloud. That was all. the sound of the gulls, and the sound of the sea. This, too, was wrong. The keepers were meant to keep the birds away. This meant no one had been outside for a very long time. Captain Harvey ordered the ship's foghorn to be fired, a signal of distress. It cracked through the air. Still nothing. No human response. Joseph Mòr felt a dread so cold it seemed to rise from the sea itself. He knew in that moment that something terrible had happened. He and 2 sailors lowered a small wooden rowboat into the surging, dangerous water. The Hesperus had to pull away for safety, leaving the small boat to fight its way alone to the landing. The sailors rowed with all their strength, climbing one vast green wave and then sliding down its back. Joseph Mòr sat in the stern, staring up at the impossible dark cliff and the white, silent tower so far above them. After a desperate, wet, and terrifying struggle, they reached the west landing. Joseph Mòr waited for the swell to rise, lifting the boat high. And in that one perfect, heart-stopping moment, he leaped from the boat onto the iron rungs set into the rock. His heavy boots found a hold. The rowboat, its job done, pulled away. He was alone on the island. He began to climb. He climbed the steep, narrow staircase that was cut into the rock. The steps were wet and slick with sea spray. The iron handrail was bitterly cold to his grasp. The wind pulled at him, trying to pluck him from the cliff face. As he climbed higher and higher, the sea churned, white and angry, 100 feet below him. He climbed above the reach of the spray, his breath pluming in the cold air. Panting, his heart hammering. He finally reached the summit. He stood on the concrete platform. The lighthouse dwelling and the tower stood before him, quiet and still. He shouted, his voice sounding small against the wind. "Hello! Ducat, Marshal!" His voice was snatched away and lost. He walked to the main entrance gate of the compound. It was closed. Latched from the inside, he unlatched it. The cold metal turned under his hand. He stepped into the courtyard, and he walked to the main door of the keeper's dwelling. He put his hand on the latch. He fully expected to find it locked, but it was not. The latch turned. The heavy wooden door creaked open on its iron hinges. He stepped inside. The silence was instant and absolute. The thick stone walls cut out the sound of the wind and replaced it with a heavy, cold, and dead quiet. He was in the small entrance hall. The first thing he saw seized his attention. The coat hooks on the wall. This is where the men hung their heavy yellow oilskins for working outside in the weather. There were 3 hooks. 2 of them were empty. One coat, a single heavy oilskin, was hanging on its peg. He knew it was the coat belonging to Donald MacArthur. This meant that James Ducat and Thomas Marshall had gone outside, but MacArthur had not. He moved, his boots echoing on the stone floor. He stepped into the kitchen, the main living space. The cold in this room was profound. It was a deep, still, penetrating cold. The fire in the grate was dead. It was not glowing embers. It was a pile of fine gray and white ashes. Cold to the touch. It had been out for many, many days. On the wall, the kitchen clock, the clock that ticked away their isolated lives, was stopped. Its hands were frozen. He looked at the kitchen table, and the scene there made his blood run cold. Plates were set for a meal that had been started but never finished. There was a plate of cold, congealed meat, and potatoes, pickles in a small dish, all of it just left, as if the men had been in the very middle of their supper. and on the stone floor, next to the table, a single wooden chair was knocked over, lying on its side. It was the only sign of disorder in the entire room, the only sign of anything like panic or a sudden violent hurry. It was as if one of the men had stood up from his meal so quickly that he had thrown his chair to the ground. Joseph Mòr backed away, a feeling of deep dread settling over him. He checked the sleeping quarters, the keepers' bedrooms. The beds were unmade. The blankets were thrown back. This again was a shocking violation of the keeper's meticulous, unchanging routine. He felt powerfully that he was trespassing, that he was in a place where he should not be. He left the cold, silent dwelling, and he entered the base of the tower itself. He began to climb the winding iron spiral staircase. The sound of his own footsteps, clang, 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 echoed up and up and up in the narrow stone tube. He climbed toward the glass lantern room. He reached the final small door and pushed it open. He stepped out into the glass heart of the lighthouse. And here the mystery was complete, because everything was in perfect order. The giant crystal lens was spotless. It gleamed in the dull gray afternoon light. The heavy brass mechanisms were polished to a mirror shine. The lamp reservoirs were full of fresh paraffin oil. The wicks were freshly trimmed. Everything was prepared down to the smallest detail, ready for the night's burning, ready to be lit. But the lamp was cold. The glass was cold. It had not been lit for many nights. On the small desk, the official lighthouse logbook was open. Joseph Mòr looked at the last entry. The handwriting was clear. The date was December 15th, 9 o'clock in the morning. 11 days ago. The entry recorded the morning's work, the weather, and then nothing. The following pages were blank. Joseph Mòr stood alone in the silent glass room, suspended between the sky and the sea. He looked out at the vast, grey, empty ocean. There was no sign of a struggle, no sign of damage to the lighthouse, no sign of anything except duty. And then a sudden, total, and impossible absence. The men were gone, all three: James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, Donald MacArthur. They had vanished from the tower, vanished from the island, leaving behind a single coat, a half-eaten meal, an overturned chair, and a lighthouse that had been perfectly prepared to shine, but had been left in the dark. Joseph Mòr stood in the cold glass lantern room, the open logbook on the desk before him. The last entry, December 15th, seemed to stare back at him. 11 days ago. He was just one man, a relief keeper, and he had found a ghost ship, a fortress of stone, empty of its guardians. He did what he was trained to do. He descended the long spiral stairs, his footsteps the only sound. He walked back out onto the high platform, into the biting, salt-laced wind. He went to the edge of the cliff and looked down at the Hesperus. It was still pitching and rolling on the heavy grey sea. He raised his arms and signaled to them. He signaled that the lighthouse was empty, that the keepers were gone. A new and deeper alarm spread. The news had to be sent. This was a formal investigation now. The Hesperus returned to the mainland, carrying the chilling, impossible news. The Northern Lighthouse Board was notified, and they sent the chief investigator, Robert Muirhead. He was the superintendent of the board, a man of logic, of process, and of the sea. It was his job to find an answer. He travelled to Eilean Mòr. His task was not simply to see what Joseph Mòr had seen. His task was to understand it, to read the story left behind in the cold, silent stone, and in the pages of the keeper's log. Before we follow Muirhead into that silent tower, we must know the men he was looking for. These were not ghosts. They were not just names in a report. They were men who had lived and breathed in that isolated place. The principal keeper was James Ducat. He was the most experienced, a steady man, a professional. He had a wife and 4 children. He was not a man given to flights of fancy. He was the anchor of the small crew, the man who enforced the rules and kept the routine. Then there was Thomas Marshall, the second assistant. He was younger, a man with a known history of writing poetry, perhaps more sensitive than the others. He, too, was an experienced keeper, and he, too, had a family waiting for him. And finally, there was the third man, Donald MacArthur, the occasional keeper. He was not a full-time lighthouse man. He was an islander, a sailor from the Hebrides. He was brought on to replace another keeper who had fallen ill. But MacArthur was no novice. He was known as a tough man, a brawler even, a burly, weathered, seasoned mariner. He was a man who had spent his entire life on or near the violent North Atlantic. He was the last man you would expect to be frightened by a storm. These were the 3 men, Ducat, the leader, Marshall, the poet, and MacArthur, the tough sailor, 3 men who had simply ceased to be. Robert Muirhead arrived on the island, and he began his work, methodically. He was not overcome by the atmosphere. He was a detective, looking for clues. He, too, walked into the unlocked dwelling. He noted the same chilling details Joseph Moore had: the cold ashes in the grate, the stopped clock, the single oilskin coat belonging to MacArthur still on its hook, the 2 empty hooks for Ducat and Marshall. He examined the unmade beds. He stood over the kitchen table. He looked at the plates of cold meat and potatoes, the half-eaten meal, and the single overturned chair. He noted that it looked as if the men had left in a sudden hurry. But he also noted the rest of the kitchen was perfectly tidy. The pots were clean. The cutlery was in its place. It was a contradiction, a moment of sudden, violent panic. In a room that was otherwise the picture of order. Muirhead knew, as all keepers did, that regulation forbade 2 men from leaving the lighthouse at once. 1 man, at all times, was required to be on duty, yet the 2 empty hooks suggested Ducat and Marshall had gone out together, leaving MacArthur inside. Why? And where was MacArthur? His coat was here, but he was gone too. Muirhead left the dwelling, and he climbed the tower. He too found the lamp room in perfect order, the wicks trimmed, the oil full, the giant lens gleaming, ready for a light that was never lit. And then he turned to the most important piece of evidence, the logbook, the official voice of the lighthouse. He sat at the desk where the last keeper had sat. He read the final normal entries, records of weather, of cleaning, of winding the clockwork, and then he turned the page, and he found the entries that would turn this mystery into a legend. The entries were written by Thomas Marshall, the poet. On December 12th, Marshall wrote in the log that the island was beset by severe winds the likes of which I have never seen before. This was strange. Muirhead knew the weather patterns of the area. There had been no reports of such a storm on that date, but Marshall's description was vivid, and then the log entry became personal and deeply disturbing. Marshall wrote that James Ducat, the steady principal keeper, had been very quiet, and then he wrote the most impossible line. Donald MacArthur has been crying. Muirhead must have read that line twice. MacArthur, the tough, seasoned brawler, was weeping. The wind must have been terrible indeed, a sound so profound, so terrifying, that it reduced a hardened sailor to tears, and made the principal keeper fall into a stunned silence. The entry ended. We are in a state of anxiety. The next day, December 13th, Marshall wrote again. The storm was still raging. He wrote that the 3 men had been praying. This, too, was a detail that chilled the blood. These were not men who prayed at the sound of a normal gale. They lived inside a fortress of stone, 150 feet above the sea. They were, by all accounts, perfectly safe. A storm, no matter how severe, could not touch them. The waves could not reach them. The wind could not break the tower. And yet they were so terrified that they had gathered together and prayed for deliverance. What storm were they witnessing? What sound could be so terrible? What were they seeing from the glass windows of the lantern room? That could make them believe their fortress was about to fail. Then the log entry for December 14th. The tone changes. The storm, which had been so apocalyptic, was suddenly gone. Marshall wrote that the weather was calm, that the sea was quiet. All seemed to be back to normal. And then the final entry. On the morning of December 15th, at 9 o'clock, the last words ever written in the Flannan Isles log. Storm ended, sea calm. God is over all. God is over all. Muirhead sat there in the silent room, staring at that last ambiguous line. Was it a line of relief? A prayer of thanks that the terror had passed? Or was it a line of resignation? A statement of acceptance that a power far greater than themselves had made itself known? God is over all. And then nothing. The logbook stops. But the story does not, because the half-eaten meal in the kitchen proves that the men were alive after this last entry. They were alive and they were eating, sometime after 9 in the morning on December 15th. Why did they stop writing in the log? Why did this calm come so suddenly? And what was the storm that only they, on their isolated rock, seemed to have experienced? Muirhead was a practical man. He needed more than a strange and frightening logbook. He needed physical evidence. He left the tower, and he began a methodical search of the island itself. The lighthouse is on the highest point, but there are 2 landing stages far below, one on the east for calmer weather, and one on the west for rougher seas. Muirhead made his way down the steep cliffside steps, the wind tearing at his coat. He went to the east landing. He found everything in order. The ropes and the crane were all secure, no damage. Then he made his way over the rocky spine of the island to the west landing, and what he found there changed the story. This landing was over 100 feet above the sea, a place that should have been safe from all but the most truly monstrous waves. What he saw was devastation. A heavy iron-railed staircase had been torn and twisted. The iron railings were bent like soft wire, ripped from their lead sockets in the solid rock. A large wooden supply crate, which had been secured to the rock, was smashed to pieces. Its contents, which included heavy ropes and tools, were gone, swept away, and a huge block of stone, weighing more than a ton, appeared to have been dislodged and moved. Muirhead stood there in stunned silence. He was looking at evidence of a power that was almost unimaginable, a wave, or a series of waves, of such colossal, monstrous force that they had come up over 100 feet, and torn solid iron and rock to pieces. This was not a normal storm. This was a primal event. Suddenly, the logbook entries made a terrible kind of sense. The men in the tower, 150 feet high, would have heard and felt these impacts like a giant hammering on the foundations of their island. They would have seen white water where no water should ever be. This would be enough to make MacArthur cry. This would be enough to make them pray. This was a storm that was not like any other. But the puzzle did not fit together. The logbook says the storm ended on the 15th. Sea calm. The damage was here, but the men were gone, and the half-eaten meal in the kitchen, and the overturned chair, and the 2 empty coats, and the 1 coat left behind. Robert Muirhead stood on the shattered landing with all the pieces of an impossible puzzle. He had a logbook that described a supernatural-seeming storm that ended in a strange final calm. He had a lighthouse that was left in perfect working order, but was dark. He had a kitchen that was abandoned in the middle of a meal, and he had a landing stage that looked like it had been attacked by a giant. The men were gone. The clues were everywhere, but they pointed in every direction and left Robert Muirhead alone on the island with the wind and the screaming gulls and the deep, profound and terrible silence of the keepers who were no longer there. Robert Muirhead stood on the shattered west landing, the wind pulling at his heavy coat. He held in his mind all the pieces of this impossible puzzle. A logbook that spoke of a terrifying localized storm, a hardened sailor weeping in fear, men gathering to pray inside a fortress of stone, a sudden cryptic calm. God is over all, and then days later, a scene of domestic stillness, violently interrupted, the cold, uneaten meal, the overturned chair, the single coat left behind. And here, before his very eyes, was evidence of a force that beggared belief. Twisted iron and smashed stone over 100 feet above the sea. Muirhead was a man of logic. He had to write a report. He had to provide an answer. The newspapers were already alive with the story. The public needed a conclusion, and so he gave them one. The one that seemed, to his practical mind, to be the most likely. It is the first and most enduring of the theories. The official explanation: it is a story of the sea's unpredictable and sudden violence. This is the theory of the rogue wave. In his report, Muirhead speculated that the storm, the one that had terrified the keepers, had passed, just as the logbook said. The final entry on December 15th, sea calm, was the truth. The men, believing the danger was over, resumed their duties. Sometime after that last entry, perhaps later that day, James Ducat, the principal keeper, and Thomas Marshall put on their oilskins. They left the tower to inspect the damage from the great storm. They would have made their way down the long, steep steps to the west landing. This is where they would have discovered the devastation, the smashed crate, the twisted railings. Muirhead's report suggests that as they were standing there, inspecting the damage, perhaps trying to secure what was left, the sea, which had seemed calm, deceived them. Far out, the chaotic energy of the recent storm had gathered itself into 1 or 2 or 3 colossal waves, freak waves, monsters born of the turbulence, a wall of black water rising silently from the swell. It struck the west landing with the force of an explosion. It would have given no warning. It overwhelmed the 2 men, Ducat and Marshall, and swept them from the rock into the churning, lethally cold Atlantic. They would have been gone in an instant, inside the lighthouse dwelling, perhaps 150 feet above. The third keeper, Donald MacArthur, was in the kitchen. He was perhaps finally sitting down to his supper. Perhaps he heard the impact, a dull, liquid boom, that shuddered through the very stone of the island. Or perhaps he heard a shout, a single, desperate cry from his companions cut short. Or perhaps he was simply looking out the thick kitchen window, and saw, to his horror, the impossible white plume of the wave, and saw his two companions vanish. In that second, his training, his discipline, all of it was forgotten. He acted on pure human panic. He jumped to his feet, throwing his chair over in his haste. This is the overturned chair. He did not pause for his coat. He did not pause for his boots. He ran. He ran from the kitchen, through the unlocked door, out into the courtyard, out onto the cliff path. He ran down the steep, winding steps, desperate to see what had happened, to find his friends, to reach them. He ran down to the west landing, and it was then that the second wave, the sister of the first, rose from the sea and claimed him too. This was Muirhead's official conclusion: death by misadventure. It was a tragedy, a terrible but understandable accident. It explained the two missing coats. It explained the one coat left behind. It explained the damage to the landing. It explained the empty lighthouse. It was neat. It was logical. It was the story that the world accepted. And yet, like a small stone in a shoe, the details did not quite fit. They nagged. They whispered in the quiet of the night. The questions remained. First, the overturned chair and the half-eaten meal. Muirhead's theory suggests MacArthur was at the table, but the table was set for a full meal. Were all three men sitting down to eat? If so, why did Ducat and Marshall, in the middle of their supper, decide to put on their oilskins and go outside into the dangerous weather to inspect damage? It seems a strange time to do such a chore, and if only MacArthur was eating, why was the full meal laid out? And then the regulations, the rules of the Northern Lighthouse Board were absolute. One man must be on watch at all times. It was the first and most sacred rule. James Ducat, as principal keeper, would never have broken it. He would never have gone to the landing with Marshall, leaving MacArthur alone in the dwelling. It was a fundamental breach of duty. It is perhaps the most unlikely part of the entire official story. And then there is the logbook. Muirhead's theory treats the logbook's terror as a separate event, a storm that happened and then ended. And then a different, unrelated rogue wave appeared out of a calm sea and killed the men. It seems a terrible coincidence. The men survive the most terrifying storm of their lives, the one that had them weeping and praying, only to be killed by a random wave hours later when the danger had seemed to pass. The official story is clean, but it leaves the heart of the mystery untouched. It does not explain the fear. It does not explain the crying. It does not explain the strange final peace. God is over all, and so we must look deeper. If the sea did not take them by accident, perhaps something else did. This leads us to the second, darker theory, a theory not of the ocean, but of the men themselves. We must consider the human element. We must imagine the isolation, the pressure of that life. 3 men trapped on a tiny rock in the middle of a vast winter ocean. The wind is not just a sound. It is a physical presence, a constant screaming, moaning, pressing force, day after day, week after week. It is a sound that is known to drive people mad. They call it cabin fever, or in this case, lighthouse madness. The crushing psychological strain of being confined with the same two people in a stone tube, with no escape. Let us imagine the scene. The great strange storm of December 12th and 13th has just passed. The tension in the lighthouse is high. Donald MacArthur, the tough sailor, has been seen crying. This perhaps has unserved the other two, or perhaps they have ridiculed him for it. A fight breaks out. We have the central piece of evidence, the overturned chair. This time, it is not a sign of a man rushing to help. It is a sign of violence. An argument at the dinner table. Perhaps one of the men snaps. Perhaps MacArthur, his mind broken by the storm's terror, becomes violent. Perhaps Marshall, the poet, provokes him. Or perhaps Duckett, the leader, tries to assert his authority and is met with a sudden violent rage. A fight. In the small kitchen, one man is killed, or perhaps two. The survivor, in a fit of panicked, murderous adrenaline, knows he cannot hide his crime. He must dispose of the bodies. He puts on the coats of his two dead companions, drags them out of the dwelling, and one by one throws them from the cliff into the churning sea that hides all secrets. And then he returns to the tower. He is alone, a murderer, trapped on the island with his guilt and the wind. He cannot live with what he has done. He walks back out of the tower, leaving his own coat behind. He goes down the steep stone steps to the same cliff edge, and he throws himself into the Atlantic, joining his victims in the cold, dark water. It is a grim story, a story of human frailty and of madness. It explains the empty island. It explains the overturned chair, and it would explain why 3 experienced men might vanish. But like the official theory, this one too begins to fray. When you look at the details, the physical evidence does not support a violent, desperate struggle. The kitchen, apart from the chair, was tidy. The pots were clean, the cutlery in its place, and most importantly, the lamp room, mutilated, murdered bodies, and a suicidal rampage, does not fit with the scene Joseph Moore and Robert Muirhead found. At the top of the tower, the lamp was perfectly prepared. The wicks were trimmed. The oil was full. The giant crystal lens was polished and gleaming. This is not the act of a man lost to a violent madness. This is the calm, meticulous work of a dedicated and sane keeper, calmly performing his duty after the terror of the logbook and before he vanished. The evidence of the lamp room seems to suggest that whatever happened, it was not a chaotic human brawl. The men were professional to the very end, and so both logical theories, the accident and the murder, leave us wanting. They feel incomplete. They leave the strangest clues unexplained. We must therefore be willing to drift into the stranger, deeper waters. We must be willing to ask the questions that do not have simple answers. This is where we find the other theories, the stories that whisper on the wind. Perhaps the men were not alone on the island. Perhaps they had visitors. Some have suggested a ghost ship, a vessel lost in the great storm, wrecked upon the sharp rocks at the base of the island. The keepers, seeing the wreck, would have been bound by the law of the sea to help. Ducat and Marshall put on their oilskins. They rushed down to the landing to try and save the survivors, but in the churning, violent water, the desperate, drowning sailors. Panicked, they grabbed at their rescuers, and in their struggle they pulled both keepers into the sea. MacArthur, seeing this from the tower, ran from his meal without his coat, and was himself pulled in by the desperate victims, or perhaps by the same treacherous waves. This is a tidy theory. It explains the coats, the chair, and the sense of duty. But there was no report of a missing ship, and no wreckage was ever found, no bodies ever washed ashore. Others have suggested something more sinister, a foreign boat landing on the island in secret. Perhaps they were spies mapping the coastline, or perhaps they were smugglers using the remote island to hide their contraband. The keepers saw them, they were witnesses, and so they were taken, abducted from the lighthouse, put on the strange boat and spirited away, never to be seen again. This would explain the empty, tidy lighthouse. It would explain the half-eaten meal, a sudden, terrifying interruption. But again, there is no evidence, no proof. It is a story woven from pure speculation, and it does not explain the logbook. It does not explain the crying, the praying, the terror that came before the vanishing. To understand that, we must go deeper. We must consider the storm itself. Thomas Marshall wrote, "Severe winds, the likes of which I have never seen before." Donald MacArthur, the veteran sailor, was weeping. What if what they heard was not wind? What if the storm was not weather? What if it was something alive? The old legends of the sea are full of monsters, of giant sea serpents, of the kraken rising from the deep. What if the storm was a creature, something that had risen from the black, cold abyss and had come to the island? What if the damage to the west landing, the twisted iron, the smashed stone, was not the work of a wave, but the work of something trying to get in? Imagine the three men trapped in their tower, listening to a sound that was not wind, but a high, keening wail, a roar from a throat larger than their tower, watching as a colossal, dark shape moved in the water below them, hammering against the rock. This would make a sailor cry. This would make them pray. This would fit the logbook's terror perfectly. And perhaps, after 3 days, it finally called to them. Perhaps the final entry, "God is over all," was a surrender, the men in a trance of terror, or perhaps of worship, calmly prepared the lamp, sat for their last meal, and then when the call came, they stood, one man knocking over his chair, and they walked out of the lighthouse, down the steps, to meet whatever was waiting for them in the water. It is a terrifying thought. But there is one last theory, one that is perhaps the strangest and the most peaceful. It has nothing to do with monsters, or with murderers, or with waves. It has to do with the island itself. Eilean Mòr, the Big Isle. Remember the shepherds who would not stay the night. They believed the island was a sacred place. They believed it was inhabited by little people, by spirits. They said it was an island that did not like to be disturbed. And then men had come. They had blasted the rock. They had built a great stone tower, and they had lit a blinding mechanical light on this ancient sacred place. Perhaps the island was waking up. What if the storm in the logbook was not a physical one? What if it was a psychic storm, a presence, an awareness, rising from the rock itself, a sound that was heard not with the ears, but with the mind, a high, thin wailing that bypassed the stone walls and went straight into the heads of the keepers? It would be a terror unlike any other. It would feel like the end of the world. It would, indeed, make a strong man weep. It would, indeed, make them pray. And then, after 3 days of this psychic siege, it stopped and was replaced by a profound and unnatural calm. The men, their minds, no longer their own, wrote the final, resigned line, "Storm ended, sea calm, God is over all." They were no longer men. They were part of the island. In a trance they performed their last duties. They trimmed the wicks, they polished the lens, they sat for their last meal. And then the island gave its final, gentle summons. The call to come home. One man stood knocking over his chair. The others followed. They walked, not in a panic, but with a strange, calm purpose. Ducat and Marshall calmly put on their coats as if going for a simple walk. MacArthur, perhaps the most deeply touched by the island's voice, did not even bother. He left his coat on the hook. The three of them walked out, through the gate, down the long stone winding steps. They walked past the shattered west landing, down to the edge of the black heaving water, and they simply kept walking, one by one. They stepped into the cold Atlantic embrace and gave themselves to the sea, to the island, to the mystery. This theory is the only one that seems to fit every single clue. The terror in the log, the sudden unnatural calm, the meticulously prepared lamp, the unfinished meal, the one overturned chair, the 2 coats taken and the one left behind. It is a story that has no earthly logic. It offers no simple answer. It only offers an echo, a feeling, a sense of a mystery, so deep it cannot be solved, only felt. These are the stories, the echoes and the theories, that have swirled around the silent tower for over 100 years. The logic of the wave, the darkness of the human heart, and the ancient, unknowable mystery of the island itself. The truth remains where it has always been, guarded by the wind and by the sea. In the end, the theories are just echoes. They are stories whispered on the wind. They offer no proof and no final piece. After all the speculation, after all the reports and the investigations, we are left where Robert Muirhead was, standing on a high, lonely rock, surrounded by an impossible and profound silence. The mystery of what happened on that day in December 1900 was never solved. But the lighthouse could not remain dark. Its beam was a vital artery of maritime safety. The Northern Lighthouse Board had to replace the men who were lost, and so a new crew was assembled, and the Hesperus made another somber journey to Eilean Mòr. Imagine being those new keepers. Imagine arriving on that landing stage, the one that still bore the scars of the damage. Imagine climbing those same winding stone steps, unlocking the same unlocked door, stepping into the cold, silent kitchen. The overturned chair would have been righted, the uneaten food would have been cleared away, but the stillness would remain. Imagine choosing your bunk, knowing it was the same bed where James Ducat or Thomas Marshall had slept. Imagine trying to light the fire in the grate that had been cold for so long. It must have been a heavy and terrifying duty, but they were professionals. They were keepers of the light, and so they climbed the tower. They wound the clockwork. They struck the match, and they lit the lamp. And out across the dark North Atlantic, the great double flash of the Flannan light returned to the sea lanes. The tower was no longer silent. It had a heartbeat once more. But the men who worked there, in the long, lonely years that followed, began to whisper They spoke of strange things, of an atmosphere that had settled in the stone, a feeling of not being quite alone. Keepers, working their shifts in the dead of night, would hear sounds, the distinct metallic sound of footsteps on the spiral, iron staircase, climbing or descending, when they knew their two companions were fast asleep. In the dwelling below, they would hear voices, faint as if carried on the wind, crying out or whispering just beyond the range of hearing. Some keepers reported a feeling of a profound and sudden sorrow that would wash over them for no reason, a coldness that had nothing to do with the weather, a feeling of being watched, always watched. From the dark corners of the rooms or from the empty grey expanse of the sea, it was as if the island would not let the story go, as if it held an echo, a memory of the three men. The lighthouse on Eilean Mòr became known as a haunted place, a place of deep and unsettling sadness. This continued for decades. Keepers came and keepers went, each man serving his long, lonely shift, each man living with the story, with the mystery in the very air he breathed. But the world outside the tower continued to change. The age of steam and paraffin and clockwork gave way to the age of electronics, and in the year 1971, the lighthouse on Eilean Mòr was automated. The great, beautiful crystal lens, the clockwork mechanism that the keepers had wound by hand. It was all replaced. A new, bright electric bulb was put in its place, a machine that would turn itself on and off, a sensor that knew when the fog rolled in. And the keepers were no longer needed after 72 years. The lighthouse could finally keep itself. The last keepers packed their bags. They took the long, winding steps down to the landing. For the final time, they stepped onto the boat, and they did not look back. No one has lived on the island for over 50 years. The dwelling is sealed, the door is locked, the beds are empty, the kitchen is cold forever. The tower still stands. It is still there right now. Tonight, as you are lying here, listening, the white tower on Eilean Mòr is standing against the dark, and its light is still sweeping the ocean, a bright, powerful, lonely, automated flash. But it is a machine now. It has no memory. It has no fear. It has no stories to tell. It is just a light, the human life of the tower, the mystery and the warmth and the terror. All of that is gone. The island is once again left to the wind and to the gulls and to its own ancient silence. The sea, that cold grey North Atlantic, holds its secrets close. It is a vast and deep archive of all the ships and all the lives it has claimed, somewhere in that dark, cold water. The truth of the Flannan Isles mystery remains. We will never know what truly happened. We will never know if it was a rogue wave, a sudden, tragic accident, or if it was a darker story of madness and human frailty, or if it was something else, something that came from the sea or from the island itself. We will never know what the men saw. We will never know what storm they heard. That was so terrible, it made a hardened sailor weep. We will never know the meaning of that last final entry. God is over all. The three men were never found, no trace of them, no body, no piece of clothing, no final sign was ever recovered from the sea. They simply stepped out of the world and into legend. They left only their names. James Ducat, Thomas Marshall, Donald MacArthur. They have become a part of the story, a part of the island. They are forever. the silent keepers. Their story is a monument, not of stone, but of questions, a quiet, enduring reminder that the world is vast and that there are still places at the edge of our maps where the lights can go out and the silence can be absolute. And so now, it is time to let the mystery go, let the questions and the theories drift away like small dark ships sailing over the far horizon. There are no more clues to find, no more logbooks to read. There is only the sound that the keepers heard every night, the sound that we began with, the constant, low, rushing sound of the wind moving over the high, dark grass, and the long, slow, rhythmic breath of the deep, cold, endless ocean. Let that sound be your guide. Let it be the only thing in your mind as you too drift away into the calm, into the quiet, and into peaceful sleep. Good night. Sleep well.